What drives a person to commit an act so heinous that it forever changes the lives of everyone around them? What happens when a past filled with trauma and violence shapes the future of a killer? This is the story of Thomas Lee Gudinas, a man who had been living on the edge, hiding behind a veil of normalcy, until one fateful night in Orlando. What began as a night out at a nightclub soon escalated into one of the most brutal, terrifying crimes that the city had ever seen. Join us as we uncover the chilling details of Gudinas' past, his terrifying actions, and the long road to justice that followed. Thomas Lee Gudinas was 28 years old, a man whose life had been marred by years of crime and personal turmoil. Born into a dysfunctional family, he grew up with a mother, Karen in Goldwaite, who was unable to provide a stable or loving environment. Gudinas faced physical and emotional abuse from an early age, leaving deep scars that would follow him into adulthood. At the age of 6, his troubled childhood led to him being placed in child care facilities, where he struggled with health and psychological issues. But despite his time in care, the damage had already been done. Gudinas was a product of a broken home and an unforgiving world, and soon, the consequences of his upbringing would play out in the most horrific way possible. On the night of May 23, 1994, Gudinas was in Orlando, visiting his relatives. It seemed like an ordinary night, one where he simply went out to enjoy himself. Little did anyone know, his violent past would soon resurface. He went to Barbarella Nightclub, where he used a fake ID to get inside, blending in among the crowd. But this was no ordinary night out for Gudinas. This was the beginning of a horrific spiral that would end with the brutal murder. Around 2 a.m., as the night wore on, Rachel Smith, a fellow club-goer, stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. She walked across the parking lot, unaware that Gudinas was watching her. As Rachel approached her car, she noticed him following her. Gudinas, a stranger to Rachel, was now only a few steps behind her. Rachel tried to ignore it at first, but as his footsteps grew louder and closer, an unsettling chill crept up her spine. She quickly locked the doors of her car, her heart pounding. Gudinas, however, wasn't finished. He began banging on her window, shouting crude, threatening remarks. "I want to you," he yelled, his voice filled with rage. In a panic, Rachel hit the horn, hoping someone would hear and intervene. Luckily, Gudinas backed off, disappearing into the night, leaving Rachel in a state of shock. What Rachel didn't know was that the nightmare wasn't over. At around 3 a.m., Michelle McGrath, a 25-year-old woman, left the Barbarella nightclub. She stepped out into the night, unaware that she was being stalked by Thomas Gudinas. She was completely alone, walking to her car, oblivious to the danger that was following her every step. But this time, there would be no escape. Gudinas attacked Michelle in a dark alley, far from the safety of the crowds. He brutally assaulted her, knocking her unconscious. Then, as if that wasn't enough, he raped her. But Gudinas wasn't done. His violence escalated further as he began kicking and stomping on Michelle's head, causing devastating injuries. Michelle McGrath died from severe head trauma, her life taken in a way that no one could ever have imagined. Gudinas, driven by a need for control and dominance, didn't stop at the murder. He further violated Michelle's body, attempting to make a statement of his cruelty. When it was all over, he left Michelle's body discarded, causing even more shock and horror when her body was discovered the next morning. The next morning, on May 24th, 1994, Jane Brand, a school employee, was walking through the alleyway when she made the grisly discovery: the body of Michelle McGrath. The police were quickly called, and the investigation began immediately. What they uncovered was chilling. Evidence began to mount swiftly. Gudinas' fingerprints, his DNA, and Michelle's personal items, including her vehicle registration slip, were found at the scene, creating a direct link between him and the murder. But the investigation didn't stop there. Rachel Smith, still rattled from her own encounter with Gudinas, came forward. She identified him as the man who had harassed her just hours earlier. This critical piece of testimony helped solidify the connection between Gudinas and Michelle's brutal attack. As the investigation intensified, Gudinas was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Though he confessed his crime in private conversations with his cellmates, he maintained his innocence in front of authorities. The evidence was undeniable, and it didn't take long for the jury to reach a verdict. In 1995, Gudinas stood trial. The courtroom was tense as the details of Michelle's murder were presented, laying bare the brutality of his actions. The defense argued that Gudinas' troubled childhood and mental health issues should be taken into account, but the jury was unswayed. Gudinas was found guilty of first-degree murder. The jury's decision was clear: death by electric chair. The courtroom, already shaken by the details of the crime, saw Gudinas break down in tears, but it was too late. His fate had been sealed. Even after his conviction, Gudinas fought to escape justice. He filed appeals, claiming that his abusive childhood and mental health issues should lead to a lesser sentence. But despite his best efforts, his appeals were repeatedly rejected. Years passed, and with each rejection, the family of Michelle McGrath grew increasingly frustrated. The wheels of justice had turned slowly, and it would take more than 30 years before Gudinas was finally scheduled to face the consequences of his actions. On June 24, 2025, the long road of waiting would finally come to an end. Gudinas would face his final reckoning. The family of Michelle McGrath, who had endured years of pain and uncertainty, would finally get the justice they had waited for. After over 30 years of appeals and legal battles, the moment of closure had arrived. But while Michelle's family felt a sense of relief, the pain of losing her would never fully fade. On the morning of June 24, 2025, after more than 3 decades of waiting, Thomas Lee Gudinas was brought to the edge of the end he had long tried to escape. For his last meal, he chose a Cuban sandwich, pizza, a hamburger, a ramen burger, and a glass of passion fruit juice, an eclectic mix that hinted at a longing for something familiar before the end. As he was strapped to the gurney, there were no final words from Gudinas. In stark contrast to the brutality of his crimes, his last moments were silent. No remorse, no apology, just the quiet hum of the execution chamber. For the victims' families, the silence was both a bitter reminder and a long-awaited closure. After decades of waiting, the man who had torn apart so many lives was gone, leaving behind only the echoes of his actions. As we reflect on the story of Thomas Gudinas, we're left with difficult questions. Is justice truly served when a life is taken in such a brutal way? Can the execution of a killer ever make up for the loss of a loved one? Gudinas' story is a stark reminder that the scars of the past can shape a person's future in ways we can't always predict. But it's also a story about the long, difficult road to justice, a journey filled with pain, loss, and the hope that one day the truth will prevail. What are your thoughts on justice, punishment, and the death penalty? Do you believe the right decision was made in the case of Thomas Gudinas? Leave your thoughts below and join the conversation. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that explore the complexities of crime, justice, and the human condition.